The desert sun was falling low over the hills when Ethan Cole walked back from the pasture. The wind carried dust across the dry land, whispering through broken fences and empty stables. Once this ranch had been full of life, cows grazing, horses running, friends visiting. Now it was quiet, almost forgotten, just like the man who owned it. Ethan lived alone in a small wooden house that smelled of old leather and hay. He was tall, with silver hair, weathered hands, and kind eyes that carried the weight of years. Ethan had been a proud rancher once, known for his honesty and hard work. But time had changed everything. After a long drought, his cattle died one by one. His wife had passed away long ago, and his grown son had moved to the city, never writing back. Slowly, neighbors sold their land and left. Ethan stayed. Maybe it was pride, maybe habit, but mostly, he couldn't leave the soil where his memories lived. Every morning he woke before sunrise, fed his one old horse, patched fences, and fixed broken gates even though no one used them anymore. He rarely went to town except for supplies, and even there, people treated him like a ghost. They would nod politely but never stay to talk. The children who once waved at him now barely knew his name. To them, he was just the forgotten rancher. That afternoon, as he poured feed for his horse, he heard a deep sound, like thunder coming from the ground. He turned toward the hills where the old Red Canyon mine stood a few miles away. The mine had been closed for years, but sometimes poor workers went there to dig for leftover copper. Ethan wiped his brow and listened again. The sound grew louder. Then came a dull, heavy crash followed by faint cries carried by the wind. His heart started racing. He knew something terrible had happened. Without thinking, he grabbed his lantern and rope, saddled his horse, and rode hard toward the canyon. Dust filled the air, making it hard to breathe. As he got closer, he saw people running out of the mine entrance, faces covered in soot, coughing and shouting. It collapsed, someone yelled. The walls came down. There's people still inside. Ethan jumped off his horse. How many? He shouted. 5, maybe 6, a man replied, his eyes wide with fear. But the air's bad down there. We can't go back in. Ethan didn't stop to think. He tied his horse, lit his lantern, and ran straight into the mine. The air inside was thick with dust. Wooden beams had cracked and rocks blocked the path. The flickering light from his lantern showed shattered carts and broken rails. He could hear faint voices, cries for help from deeper inside. Hold on, Ethan shouted. I'm coming. He crawled under fallen beams, his hands bleeding from sharp rocks. Every move stirred more dust. The light dimmed, but he kept going. Then he saw her, a young Apache girl trapped beneath a heavy plank. She looked no older than 13, her small hands trying to move the wood. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears, and her dark hair was tangled around her shoulders. Don't move, Ethan said gently, kneeling beside her. I'll get you out. She looked at him with frightened eyes. It hurts, she whispered in broken English. I know, sweetheart. Just breathe. He pressed his shoulder against the beam and pushed, but it didn't move. He tried again, grunting, sweat dripping from his forehead. The air was getting thinner. Each breath burned his chest. He looked around and found a piece of metal pipe. Using it for leverage, he pushed again with all his strength until the beam lifted just enough. The girl crawled out, crying softly. Ethan picked her up in his arms. You're safe now, he said. But the way out was blocked by fallen rocks. He scanned the tunnel and saw a narrow passage to the side, barely big enough for one person. Can you crawl? He asked her. She nodded, still trembling. Ethan led the way, pushing debris aside and guiding her through the narrow tunnel. Dust filled their mouths and eyes. Several times she coughed so hard he thought she'd faint, but he kept encouraging her. Almost there, he said softly. Just a little more. Finally, they saw daylight, a thin golden line at the end of the tunnel. Ethan pulled himself out first, then reached back and lifted her out. Outside, the others ran toward them, shouting in relief. The girl's mother cried out and hugged her tightly. Ethan dropped to his knees, exhausted. His lungs burned from the smoke and his hands were raw. A few men patted his shoulder, thanking him. But he didn't stay to talk. Once he saw the girl safe, he simply nodded, picked up his hat, and walked back to his horse. The girl broke free from her mother for a moment and ran after him. She tugged at his sleeve. Thank you, she said, her voice small but clear. He turned, surprised. You're welcome, little one, she pointed at her chest. Taya, she said softly, introducing herself. Ethan smiled faintly. Taya, that's a strong name. She hesitated, then reached out and touched his hand, her dark eyes filled with emotion. "You, good man," she said slowly, as if choosing each word carefully. Then her mother called her and she ran back. Ethan stood there for a long moment, watching them disappear down the dusty trail. The sky was deep orange now, the sun sinking behind the cliffs. He felt something he hadn't felt in years, peace, maybe even pride. When he reached home, he washed the dust from his face and sat on his porch listening to the desert wind. For years he had believed his life had no meaning, that he was just waiting for time to forget him completely. But now he realized that even a forgotten man could still make a difference. He had saved a life, an innocent one. That night, as stars filled the sky, Ethan couldn't sleep. He kept seeing the girl's eyes in the lantern light, afraid but brave. He wondered what would become of her, where she would go. He didn't know her world or her tribe, but something deep inside told him she would grow into someone important. In the following days, people in the nearby town talked about the rescue. They called him a hero for a short while, but Ethan didn't care about the praise. He didn't go to church or town meetings. He didn't want to be thanked. For him, it was enough to know she was alive. Weeks passed, then months. Life on the ranch returned to silence. The memory of that day became part of his daily thoughts, like the morning wind or the sound of his horse breathing. Sometimes he would ride near the canyon, stop his horse and stare at the mine entrance. He would remember the dust, the fear, and the small voice saying, "Thank you." And though he didn't know it yet, that single act of courage, done quietly, without expecting anything in return, would come back to him years later in ways he could never imagine. For now, he was just Ethan Cole, the forgotten rancher who had found a reason to keep going. He leaned back on his porch, hat low over his eyes, and watched the stars blink in the cold sky. Somewhere out there, a young Apache girl was alive, growing up and carrying a memory of him, and that was enough. 15 years had passed since that terrible day at the Red Canyon mine. The land had changed, but the silence around Ethan Cole's ranch remained the same. The once busy trails were now empty, and the small towns nearby had grown into quiet settlements with paved roads and electric poles. The Red Canyon mine was sealed off long ago, and few even remembered that there had been a collapse there. Ethan was older now, his hair completely white, his back slightly bent from years of hard work. Yet every morning he still rose before the sun and walked across the land he loved. The desert wind had a voice he understood, a whisper of memory, a reminder of how small and precious life was. His days followed a steady rhythm. He would feed his old horse, Dusty, check the water trough, and fix a gate or two. He talked to the animals as if they were old friends. Sometimes he laughed softly at his own jokes, though no one else was around to hear them. When the evenings grew cool, he sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, watching the horizon fade into shades of orange and purple. But even in that quiet life, one memory refused to fade, the young Apache girl he had rescued from the collapsed mine. He still remembered her small hand touching his, the look in her eyes and her soft voice saying, "Thank you." It had been a brief moment, but it had left a lasting mark on his heart. Each year, on the same day the mine had collapsed, Ethan saddled his horse and rode to Red Canyon. The path was rough and covered in weeds, but he knew every turn by memory. When he reached the spot where the rescue had taken place, he would pick wildflowers, usually desert lilies or small yellow daisies, and place them on a rock near the entrance. He never told anyone why he did it. He didn't need to. "Wherever you are, I hope you're safe," he would whisper, his voice lost in the wind. He didn't know that people from the Apache community sometimes saw him from a distance during those visits. They called him the Silent Watcher, an old white rancher who came once a year to honor a memory no one else understood. Years continued to slip away like sand through his fingers. Ethan didn't have much left. No wife, no children nearby, no family photos except one of his parents. But he had something many people didn't: peace. It was a lonely peace, but it was honest. He had accepted that life didn't always give answers or rewards. Sometimes doing good simply meant knowing inside your heart that it was right. Then came a season of hard change. One spring, a heavy storm swept across the desert, flooding the lowlands and damaging parts of his ranch. The roof leaked, the fences fell, and Dusty caught a bad cough that wouldn't go away. Ethan worked day and night, repairing everything with his own hands. But his body was not as strong as before. One evening, after hammering a fence post, he felt dizzy and had to sit down. He realized for the first time how old he had become. When he went to town for medicine and supplies, people greeted him politely but briefly. He overheard younger men joking in the store. "That old rancher's still hanging on. Guess he'll never sell that land." Ethan smiled faintly but said nothing. He had stopped expecting kindness from strangers long ago. Still, small moments of beauty found him. A family of wild horses often grazed near his ranch in the early mornings. He would stand quietly and watch them, the way they moved with freedom and grace. He loved those simple scenes. They reminded him that life, even in silence, could still be beautiful. One evening, as he cleaned his lantern, he looked at an old newspaper clipping pinned to his wall. It was from the week after the mine collapse. The headline read, "Local Rancher Saves Child in Mine Disaster." The paper was yellow and fragile now, but the words were still clear. Beneath the title was a small picture of him, younger and proud, standing with a hat in his hands. He hadn't saved the clipping for fame. He kept it as proof that his life had meant something once, that even a forgotten man could make a difference. Years rolled on. Ethan grew slower. Dusty passed away one cold winter morning, and he buried the horse under a mesquite tree. After that, his loneliness deepened. He spent more time on his porch, wrapped in a blanket, looking at the mountains in the distance. Sometimes he thought he saw a figure walking along the ridge, but it was always the wind playing tricks. Then something unexpected began happening in the nearby lands. The Apache Nation started restoring their old territories and traditions. The government finally returned some of the land that had been taken long ago. New schools were built, and young tribal leaders began organizing community projects, cultural centers, wildlife protection, and heritage trails. Ethan heard about it in the newspapers and felt quietly proud, though he didn't know why. It felt right seeing the people of the land rising again with strength and pride. He wondered what had become of that little girl, Taya. Was she part of this new movement? Had she grown up to be a teacher, a mother, or maybe even a leader? He smiled at the thought, then shook his head. "She probably doesn't even remember me," he muttered to himself. But deep inside, he hoped she did. Every night before sleeping, he sat by the window and looked at the stars. The desert sky was clear and endless, and the stars seemed closer out there, like old friends keeping him company. Sometimes he spoke softly to them, telling stories about the old days, about his father teaching him to ride, about the storms, and about that one unforgettable rescue. The years of silence continued, but something in the air felt different, like the wind carried a new message. Ethan couldn't explain it, but he often woke up feeling as though someone somewhere was thinking of him. Then one day, while fixing a broken gate, he found an eagle feather caught in the wire. It was large and beautiful, shining softly under the sun. He picked it up carefully, brushed off the dust, and smiled. "You don't see these much anymore," he said aloud. "Maybe it's a good sign." He tucked the feather into his hatband, not knowing how meaningful that small moment would become later. That evening, he rode out once more to Red Canyon. The wind felt warm, carrying the scent of sage and rain. The mine entrance was now fenced off, but he still placed wildflowers at the old rock. He stood there quietly, remembering every sound, every breath from that day 15 years ago. As the sky turned gold, he whispered again, "Wherever you are, Taya, I hope you're safe." He didn't know that far away in another town, a young Apache woman wearing a turquoise necklace had just been chosen as the new tribal chief. Her name was Taya Redbird, and when she accepted her title, she said a quiet prayer for a man she never forgot, the rancher who had carried her out of the darkness and given her life a second chance. For now, Ethan rode home under the setting sun, unaware that fate was quietly turning. The years of silence were ending. Life was about to surprise him in the most unexpected way. The next morning started like any other. Ethan Cole rose early, brewed a pot of coffee, and stepped out onto his porch. The golden light of dawn stretched across the open land, touching the distant hills with soft color. He leaned on the railing and took a deep breath of the cool air. For a man who lived alone, mornings like this were peaceful. They reminded him that even if people forgot him, the land never did. He watched a hawk glide high above the fields, wings wide, steady in the wind. "You've got no worries up there," he said softly. "Just the sky and your freedom." He smiled faintly, though his heart felt heavy with age. After breakfast, he started his chores. The fences always needed mending, and the barn roof still leaked from the last storm. His hands were slower now, but he refused to let the ranch fall apart completely. It was the only thing that still gave his days a reason. By noon, the sun was strong and heat waves danced over the land. Ethan rested under the shade of a mesquite tree, drinking from his canteen. That's when he heard it, a low rumble, not from thunder this time, but from engines. He looked up and saw a line of vehicles moving slowly down the dirt road toward his property. Dust rose behind them like a trail of ghosts. Ethan squinted. "Now what in the world?" he murmured. No one ever came out this far. The vehicles stopped near his front gate. He counted 4 of them, dark SUVs with tribal emblems painted on the doors. From the first one, a tall woman stepped out. She wore a long tan coat, and the sunlight glimmered on a turquoise necklace that rested against her chest. Her black hair was braided neatly and her posture was straight, full of quiet power. A few men and women followed her, all dressed in traditional patterns mixed with modern style. They carried papers, cameras, and boxes. The woman looked around the old ranch with thoughtful eyes, then walked toward him with calm steps. Ethan waited by his porch, his hat shading his eyes. "Can I help you folks?" he asked politely, his voice carrying that soft western drawl. The woman smiled. "Mr. Ethan Cole?" "Yes, ma'am," he replied, slightly surprised. "That's me, though not many call me that anymore." She nodded slowly, studying his face. "You might not remember me," she said softly, "but I remember you." Ethan blinked. There was something familiar in her voice, though it was deeper now, stronger. "Have we met before?" he asked. The woman stepped closer, her eyes steady and kind. "A long time ago, at the Red Canyon mine," Ethan froze. The air seemed to stop around him. "The mine?" he whispered. 15 years back?" She nodded. "You saved a little girl that day." His eyes widened as the memory flooded back. The smoke, the fear, the small voice saying, "Thank you." Slowly, he took off his hat, holding it against his chest. "Taya?" he said softly. She smiled, her eyes glistening. "Yes," she said. "My name is Taya Redbird now. Chief Taya Redbird." Ethan stood speechless for a moment, then laughed softly in disbelief. "Well, I'll be," he said, shaking his head. "You were just a child. Look at you now," she smiled warmly. "I have thought about this day for many years. I always hoped I'd find you. Find me? What for?" Ethan asked, still amazed. "To thank you properly," she said, "and to tell you that your kindness changed my life and my people's future." Ethan looked at her, his weathered face softening. "I just did what anyone would have done." Taya shook her head gently. "Not anyone. Others ran away that day. You stayed. You risked everything for someone you didn't even know. That act gave me life, and now I want to return something to you." Ethan didn't know what to say. He had never thought that the girl would remember him, much less come back after all these years. "You didn't have to come all this way for me," he said quietly. "I did," she replied, "because we're building a memorial at the Red Canyon site, a place to remember those who died that day, and those who saved lives. I came to ask for your permission to carve your name there." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "My name?" "Yes," she said firmly. "You are part of our story, Mr. Cole. The tribe wants to honor you at the ceremony next month." For a long moment, Ethan didn't speak. His hands trembled slightly as he held his hat. "I never expected anything like that," he finally said. "I'm not a man for speeches or honors." Taya smiled softly. "Sometimes the quietest men leave the loudest mark." Ethan chuckled, a bit embarrassed. "I don't know about that, but I appreciate it." She looked around his ranch. "You've lived here all these years?" "Born here, raised here, and likely I'll be buried here," he said with a small grin. "This land's been my only friend." Taya nodded thoughtfully. "The land remembers its people," she said. "Just like we do." They spent the afternoon talking on the porch. She told him about her life, how after the mine disaster her family moved to the tribal community, and she grew up surrounded by elders who taught her about strength and compassion. She studied hard, worked to preserve her people's traditions, and was eventually chosen as tribal chief. Ethan listened quietly, proud and amazed. "You've done something real good with your life," he said. "Your folks must be proud." Taya looked down for a moment, her eyes softening. "They are gone now," she said gently. "But I carry their spirit with me, just as I carry yours." That touched Ethan deeply. He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded, his throat tight with emotion. Before leaving, Taya handed him a small wooden box. Inside was a handmade turquoise necklace, its beads shining softly in the light. "Our people made this for you," she said. "It's a symbol of gratitude and connection." Ethan looked at it with wonder. "I can't take this, it's too fine a gift." "You must," Taya said kindly. "It belongs to you now." He held it carefully, feeling the smooth coolness of the stones. "I thank you," he said quietly. "This means more than you know." As her convoy prepared to leave, she turned back to him. "The ceremony will be held in 3 weeks at the canyon," she said. "Please come." "It would honor all of us if you did." Ethan smiled gently. "I'll be there. Wouldn't miss it for the world." When the vehicles drove away, the dust settled slowly, leaving silence once again. Ethan stood on his porch, the necklace in his hand, staring after them. He felt something inside him shift, like a weight he didn't know he carried had lifted. For years he had believed his life no longer mattered, but now he knew that one act of kindness had grown into something far greater than himself. That evening, he hung the turquoise necklace beside his old lantern. Where the light from the sunset touched it gently, it shimmered like a small piece of sky glowing with meaning. He sat down, smiling to himself. The years of loneliness suddenly felt worthwhile. Every fence he mended, every quiet ride, every visit to the canyon, it all led to this moment. Somewhere deep down, he realized that he hadn't been forgotten after all. He whispered softly to the empty sky, "Guess the world remembers in its own way." And as darkness fell, the sound of coyotes echoed in the distance. But instead of feeling alone, Ethan felt something new. Peace mixed with pride, and a quiet warmth that came from being remembered. The forgotten rancher was no longer forgotten. He was part of a story that had traveled through time, through generations, and through the heart of a woman who never stopped remembering the man who saved her life. The morning of the ceremony came bright and calm, the desert sky painted in soft shades of gold and rose. Ethan Cole stood by his small mirror, adjusting the collar of his old white shirt. It had been years since he had worn anything other than dusty ranch clothes, but today was different. Today he was heading to Red Canyon, not to fix a fence or bring flowers, but to stand among people who remembered. He brushed his silver hair carefully and put on his weathered hat. Around his neck hung the turquoise necklace that Taya Redbird had given him weeks earlier. Its color matched the early morning sky, glowing gently against his faded shirt. For the first time in years, Ethan felt nervous. Not because he feared anything, but because he wasn't used to being seen. He loaded his truck, an old blue pickup that groaned with every mile, and started down the long dirt road toward the canyon. The land stretched wide and quiet, dotted with cactus and wild sage. As he drove, he couldn't help but think of that day long ago. The crash of the mine, the frightened voices, and that small girl's eyes. It felt like another lifetime. When he reached Red Canyon, he stopped his truck near a group of parked vehicles. People were gathering, men, women, and children dressed in beautiful traditional clothing. The sound of soft drums carried through the air, steady and peaceful. The canyon walls glowed red under the sun, just as they had on the day of the collapse, but now the place felt alive again. Ethan stepped out slowly, holding his hat. A few people turned and looked his way. Some nodded, others smiled gently as if they already knew who he was. He walked closer, feeling both shy and humbled. He had spent half his life alone, and now suddenly he was surrounded by faces full of respect and warmth. Then he saw her, Chief Taya Redbird, standing near a tall stone covered by a white cloth. She wore a traditional dress decorated with beadwork, and around her shoulders was a blanket of deep red and turquoise. When she noticed Ethan, her eyes lit up with recognition and joy. "Mr. Cole," she said warmly, walking toward him. "You came." Ethan tipped his hat, smiling. "Didn't think I'd miss it, ma'am. You invited me and I keep my word." Taya laughed softly. "I knew you would." She guided him toward the front row where a seat had been saved for him. It was placed near the memorial stone, surrounded by flowers and small handmade gifts left by children. As the ceremony began, a group of elders formed a circle and began to sing in their native language. The low rhythm of drums echoed off the canyon walls, blending with the soft rustle of the wind. Ethan sat quietly, his eyes glistening. The music carried something ancient, something that touched his heart in a way words never could. When the songs ended, Taya stepped forward to speak. Her voice was strong yet gentle, echoing through the open air. "Today," she began, We gather not only to honor the lives lost in the Red Canyon collapse, but also to remember the courage that rose from the darkness. On that day, a man who had nothing left gave everything he had. He entered the broken mine when others fled. He carried out a child he did not know, and by doing so, changed the future of an entire people. The crowd listened silently, the only sound the wind brushing against the rocks. Taya turned toward Ethan. That man is here with us today, Mr. Ethan Cole, the rancher who saved my life. Ethan felt his heart pound. People began to clap softly, not with noise or show, but with deep respect. Some stood. Others placed their hands over their hearts. Ethan swallowed hard, unsure how to react. He wasn't used to praise. Taya continued. He may not have known it then, but his kindness became a part of our tribe's story. Because of him, I am here today. Because of him, I learned that courage has no color and compassion has no boundary. She walked over to him, holding a beautifully woven blanket in her hands. Its design was made of sky blue and sand-colored patterns, representing protection and friendship. Mr. Cole, she said softly, our elders have asked that you accept this blanket as a symbol of our gratitude. You are now and forever a friend of the Apache Nation. The crowd fell silent as she gently placed the blanket over his shoulders. Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he touched the soft fabric. Tears filled his eyes, but he tried to hide them behind a shaky smile. I don't know what to say, he whispered. Taya smiled. You've already said enough 15 years ago with your actions. A quiet laugh passed through the crowd, warm and kind. Then the cloth covering the memorial was pulled away, revealing a smooth stone carved with names. Among them, near the bottom, was one that stood out clearly in the sunlight. Ethan Cole, the rancher who remembered humanity. Ethan stared at the carving for a long moment, his chest rising with slow, steady breaths. He reached out and traced the letters with his fingers, feeling the coolness of the stone. In that instant, he realized something simple but powerful. He had never been forgotten. The world might have moved on, but his act of kindness had lived on in the hearts of others. After the ceremony, people gathered around him. Children offered him small gifts, painted stones, feathers, and handmade bracelets. Elders shook his hand and thanked him for his bravery. One man said, "You showed us what real strength looks like, not with guns or power, but with heart." Ethan didn't know what to reply. He just nodded, smiling humbly. Later, as the sun dipped low, a group of young dancers performed in the open field near the canyon. Their feet moved lightly to the beat of the drums, their voices rising in joyful song. Taya sat beside Ethan, both watching in silence. It's strange, he said after a while. I never thought I'd be part of something like this. I've lived out here for so long I almost forgot what it's like to belong. Taya turned to him. You never stopped belonging, she said. Sometimes the world just takes time to remember. Ethan smiled softly. Maybe so. He looked around at the people laughing, dancing, and sharing food. It reminded him of days long gone, barn dances, family picnics, simpler times before loneliness took over. When the ceremony ended, Taya walked with him back to his truck. The sky was now deep orange, and the first stars were appearing above the desert hills. Thank you for coming, Mr. Cole, she said gently. You've given us more than you'll ever know. Ethan looked at her with quiet affection. You've given me something too. Chief, a reason to be proud again. She smiled, and for a moment, there was only silence between them, an unspoken understanding that went beyond words or years. Before he left, Taya handed him a small pouch. Inside is some sacred soil from the canyon, she explained. Keep it near your home. It carries the spirit of this land and the memory of today. Ethan accepted it, touched beyond words. I'll take good care of it, he promised. As he drove home through the darkening desert, he glanced in the mirror and saw the canyon fading behind him, glowing faintly under the rising moon. On the seat beside him lay the pouch and the folded blanket. His heart felt full in a way it hadn't in decades. That night, back at his ranch, he placed the pouch above his fireplace, beside the turquoise necklace. Then he sat on his porch, wrapped in the gifted blanket, and looked out across the silent land. The stars seemed brighter that night, as if they too had come to honor him. He whispered softly, Guess I'm not so forgotten after all. And in the quiet wind that swept across the desert, it felt as if the land itself answered back, thanking the man who had once saved a child and, without knowing it, saved an entire story. The weeks that followed the ceremony at Red Canyon brought a quiet kind of happiness to Ethan Cole's life, one that he hadn't felt in decades. His days were still simple, filled with the same chores and routines, but now every sunrise seemed warmer, every breeze softer. The loneliness that once weighed heavy on him had lifted, replaced by something gentler: connection. He visited the Apache community often after that. Sometimes Taya herself would come to his ranch, her car stirring up clouds of dust along the long road. She always greeted him with a bright smile and a respectful nod. "How's the old rancher doing today?" she'd tease. Ethan would laugh, his eyes twinkling. "Still kicking, Chief. The desert's got a hard time getting rid of me." Their friendship grew naturally, like the desert flowers after rain. They shared long talks about the land, its people, and the importance of remembering where one came from. Taya loved hearing about the old cowboy days, how ranchers worked from dawn to dusk, how the land taught patience and endurance. Ethan, in turn, listened to her stories about the tribe's renewal, the schools they built, the language classes for children, the young ones learning the traditions their grandparents once feared to share. "You've done something powerful," Ethan told her one day as they sat under the shade of a cottonwood tree near the creek. "You turned your pain into something good for others." Taya smiled softly. "You taught me that, Ethan. The day you saved me, I promised I'd live a life that mattered, that I'd make your kindness count." He looked at her thoughtfully. "Guess we both kept our promises then." Over the months, the bond between the rancher and the chief became a quiet symbol for everyone who knew them. A reminder that compassion could bridge any distance, that humanity didn't wear one face or belong to one people. Many times Ethan helped the tribe with small things, teaching young riders how to train horses, showing them how to mend fences or fix a saddle. In return, the tribe often brought him food from their harvest: corn, beans, squash, and handmade bread. The children loved visiting him. They called him Grandfather Ethan. One summer evening, the tribe invited him to a storytelling night by the canyon. Ethan sat near the fire as the stars came out, listening to the elders tell tales of bravery, spirits, and the strength of the land. Then, to his surprise, one of the young storytellers stood up and began a new story. "This is the story of a man who was forgotten," the boy said, his small voice steady. "He lived alone in the desert, but one day he risked his life to save a child from the earth's anger. He thought no one would remember him, but the wind did, and so did the people he saved." As the boy continued, the tribe watched Ethan, their faces glowing in the firelight. He smiled shyly, looking down, his heart swelling with quiet pride. When the story ended, the crowd clapped softly and Taya leaned over to whisper, "You've become part of our stories, Ethan. You'll live in them long after we're gone." He chuckled. "Well, I suppose there are worse ways to be remembered." Life went on peacefully after that. Ethan continued to visit the canyon, not out of sorrow anymore, but gratitude. The place that once held memories of fear and loss now felt sacred and alive. Every time he stood before the stone with his name carved on it, he felt a wave of calm wash over him. It was as if the earth itself was thanking him for staying true to his heart. As the years passed, Ethan grew frailer. His steps slowed, his hands shook, and his breath came shorter. But his spirit stayed strong. He often joked, "Guess I'll rust before I break." But Taya could see the changes. She began visiting him more often, bringing herbal teas and warm meals prepared by the tribe. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in deep orange, she found him sitting on his porch, wrapped in the ceremonial blanket the tribe had given him. He was watching the horizon with a peaceful look. "You still keeping the land company, old friend?" she asked softly. Ethan smiled. "Somebody's got to. The land listens better than most folks anyway." They sat together in silence for a while, the air filled with the hum of crickets. Then Taya turned to him and said quietly, "When you're gone, Ethan, we'll keep coming here. We'll keep this ranch alive. You'll always have a place with us." He nodded slowly. "That means more to me than I can say, Chief." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small pouch of sacred soil she had given him at the ceremony. "When my time comes," he said softly, "I want this scattered here, right where we sit now, so I can rest with the wind and the stars." Taya took his hand gently. "It will be done," she promised. Not long after, on a cool autumn morning, Ethan Cole passed away peacefully in his sleep. There was no struggle, no pain, just the quiet end of a long, honest life. The turquoise necklace still hung around his neck, and his hat rested by his bedside. When the news reached the tribe, the community fell silent. Taya closed her eyes and whispered a prayer. Then, as she had promised, she gathered her people and rode to Ethan's ranch. The ceremony was simple but filled with love. They wrapped him in the blanket he had been given and buried him near the porch where he had spent so many sunsets. At dawn, Taya stood by his grave, holding the small pouch of sacred soil. She scattered it gently into the wind, just as Ethan had wished. "You are part of this land now," she whispered. "The earth never forgets kindness." The wind picked up, swirling softly around them, carrying her words away into the open sky. It felt as though the land itself was responding, whispering back with gratitude. After his passing, the tribe took care of his ranch. They repaired the fences, planted flowers around the porch, and kept his horse stable as a memorial site. Visitors often came to learn his story, the tale of the forgotten rancher who became a legend through one act of courage. Years later, children would still visit the Red Canyon Memorial. They would trace their fingers over his carved name and listen to their elders tell his story, and each time the ending was always the same. Ethan Cole, the forgotten rancher who remembered humanity. Under the wide desert sky, his legacy lived on, not through fame or riches, but through the kindness he had given freely. His spirit became part of the land, part of the stories whispered by the wind, part of the strength that guided those who came after. Sometimes, when the wind blew across the canyon just right, people said they could hear faint laughter, like the sound of an old rancher greeting the morning sun. Chief Taya Redbird often returned to that spot, standing beside the stone with his name. She would place fresh wildflowers there, the same kind he had always brought to the canyon, and each time she'd whisper, "Thank you, old friend. You showed us that a single good heart can change the world." And in the quiet beauty of the desert, it felt as though the land itself smiled, because heroes like Ethan Cole never truly die. They become part of the wind, part of the earth, and part of every story that reminds us what it means to be human.